Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Westworld Season 1. This review will be spoiler-free for the first half of the video. However, it will feature a spoiler section at the end of the video for those who have seen all of Season 1 of Westworld, but those who haven't will be safe from spoilers until I give a proper spoiler warning. So Westworld is a new smash hit on HBO. Many consider it a successor to Game of Thrones, which is the most successful show HBO has ever had, and it's coming to an end in just a few years. So many consider Westworld HBO's attempt to have another smash hit replacement for when it does go off the air. So I first heard of this show a few months before it aired, where I watched the trailer for it. The trailer was somewhat intriguing as it had top-notch actors like Anthony Hopkins, Ed Harris, and James Madison. But after watching it several times, I decided the show did not look all that interesting to me, as the premise was a Western theme park with androids where people can go to feel like they're in the Old West, and plus the fact I heard this was based off of a Michael Crichton screenplay didn't sound that appealing to me, as I kind of had enough of his stories, so I made the decision not to watch the show. But around the time it started to air, I heard a lot of people that I know talking about how they were going to watch it, and once the show started, my channel got absolutely bombarded by comments asking if I was watching the show, or saying that I should watch the show, or saying that I should review the show. In fact, if I were to be perfectly honest, I got so many comments that started to annoy me, and it wasn't just that, but the overall hype around the show was absolutely tremendous, many making grandiose statements like this is the best show currently airing on television, and many comparing it to Game of Thrones, as some claiming that it was better. So here's the thing, based on posts, articles, and comments I saw before the show even aired, it seemed apparent to me that the show was so well hyped before it even began or got going that many were convinced that it was an amazing show before it even aired. For example, I did a video called 5 Shows Game of Thrones Fans Should Be Watching, where I named 5 shows I thought Game of Thrones fans would enjoy, and I got a comment on that video asking why Westworld wasn't included, and the thing is, Westworld had only aired one episode at that time, so I thought it was pretty outrageous people were ready to declare the show one of the greatest after one episode. Even my favorite shows, such as Game of Thrones and Breaking Bad, I had to watch at least one full season before making those kinds of statements. So this does lead me to the inescapable conclusion that many had already decided that the show was great before even watching it, just based off of the cast or creative minds involved like Michael Crichton, Jonathan Nolan, and the high production value presented in the trailers. Now this is a general statement that I'm sure doesn't apply to everyone, as I'm sure there are some who love the show who knew nothing about it before watching it or hadn't expected it to be great, but based off of evidence, not off of whims, off of actual posts and comments that I saw, I have to say there were definitely a lot of people who were already predisposed to loving the show before even watching it. Now, after hearing all this hype, my interest was definitely piqued, and I decided to definitely needed to watch the show. However, there were a few dissenting voices, most particularly my brother, whose opinions on shows and movies tend to be similar to my own, who thought the show was overrated and not nearly as good as many were claiming it to be. Considering how much hype it was getting, I considered that possibility to be likely. So I decided to wait until the season finished before watching it so I could binge it all at once. And this is part of because my brother talked about how the show was having some pacing issues where the first half of the season moved too slowly. So I knew I know that there may be some that accuse me of having made up my mind before watching the show, and it is true I came in a tad bit skeptical, but overall with an open mind. And I would also point out that some of my favorite all-time shows like Game of Thrones, Lost, Breaking Bad were also ridiculously overhyped for me before I watched it, much in the same way. So I approached many of these shows with the same skepticism, but the power of the shows themselves is what changed my mind and made me consider them one of the best of all time. But the problem is, once a show gets so much hype, that automatically sets a high bar for it to live up to. So now for the moment of truth. What did I think of the show once I watched it? Did I enjoy it? Yes. Did I think it was a good quality show? Yes. Was I glad I watched it? Yes. Do I plan on watching future seasons? Most definitely yes. But do I think it's one of the best shows of all time? No. Would I mention this in the same breath as Game of Thrones, saying it's just as good, if not better? No. Do I think it is a bit overrated? I'd have to go with yes. So, although I did really enjoy this show, I'd have to agree with the detractors that the pacing was a bit off and some of the characters came off as a bit flat and cliched. Although the pacing didn't really bother me that much because it wasn't nearly as bad as some other shows that have absolutely horrible pacing. Walking Dead. And in fact, many of my favorite shows like Game of Thrones, Lost, and Breaking Bad can have some bad pacing and a series of slow-paced episodes from time to time, though those shows have the benefit of having multiple seasons, so you can look back and overall the quality outweighs a few slow-paced moments, whereas Westworld only has one season to go off of. So if I were, for example, to compare only season 1 of Breaking Bad to only season 1 of Westworld, I say the pacing issues were about equal, but then again, I know that Breaking Bad makes up for it with better pacing in the future, and that still remains to be seen with Westworld. So since one season is all we have to go off on with Westworld, that's all I have to judge it on. So far, I'd say it's a bit out there to call this one season that has a little bit of bad pacing to be one of the greatest that there ever was. So what exactly do I mean when I talk about pacing? Well, they had a pilot episode which was interesting enough. It was an intriguing episode, although I wouldn't go as far to say it was the greatest thing since sliced bread, as many others were saying, but I did quite enjoy it, and I would say it was a powerful start that had me hooked. The problem came in with episodes 2 through 5, which were all too slow-paced and weren't nearly as interesting or engaging. Now, the show did pick up in episode 6 and would be much better through to the end of the season, but those episodes 2 through 5 moved very slowly, and that they started to lose my interest and wouldn't at all seem to belong to the greatest show ever. However, watching the show the way I did gave me several benefits. First off, I had been told by the detractors that the show was really slow at first but got better towards the end, so I knew what to expect, so wasn't too disappointed when the show was moving slowly. I knew it would get better, so I knew to stick with it. Also, binging it all over a couple of days was beneficial, as I didn't have to wait week to week for this slow-moving story and can just blow through it in a few hours. And indeed, when the show got good towards the end of the season, it was good not having to be kept in suspense for a week and just be able to go to the next episode automatically. So I would say I am very happy with my decision to binge the show, and that's actually more enjoyable to watch in this format because it does seem to play better as a singular movie rather than an episodic TV show. Now, some may say the downside to this is I missed out on all the theorizing and fan speculation that went on between episodes and thus missed out on the collective fan experience. However, I personally think I'm glad I missed out on that because I did have a bit of time after watching episode 9 and before watching the finale, so I did watch a few YouTube videos and heard for the first time a couple of fan theories, and there was one in particular I hadn't at all considered, but as soon as I heard it, I knew it was correct, and sure enough it was. So I feel this kind of ruined the finale for me a bit, knowing the big twist that was coming. And indeed, I saw several others also complain that pretty much every major fan theory did come to pass in the show. So a few other shocking revelations that I saw earlier that I didn't see coming also would have been ruined for me had I been paying attention to these fan theories. So I'm actually glad that I wasn't, and think my decision to binge the show was the correct one, and I am seriously considering doing it for season 2. Now, as for the characters, there are a lot of characters in the show that feel more like stereotypes and walking cliches who are there simply to service the plot. Now, this doesn't bother me all that much because there are a lot of shows that do this and still manage to be interesting and engaging, and with Westworld in particular, this is kind of made up for by the many characters who are very well developed, interesting, and dynamic characters. So this didn't bother me that much at first, but it wasn't until the end of the series this really bothered me when looking back on the show as a whole, because when you do so, you notice a pattern, and that That pattern is the characters that aren't well developed are the human characters, with two noticeable exceptions, and the ones who are well developed are the robots or the hosts. And this presents a certain problem to me, as I was watching a video once where someone posed the question of who do you ultimately side with, the hosts or the humans. And the problem is that the game is rigged to have the audience side with and identify with the host more than the humans, and see the humans more as villains. By having the human characters be one-sided, cliched caricatures, it makes them less relatable, and the hosts are portrayed as more dynamic and easier to sympathize with. In fact, the few human characters that are presented in a well-rounded and dynamic way tend to be more sympathetic to the hosts, and thus the show is rigged to present a one-sided story that is not very dynamic, where there are clear two-dimensional villains and clear heroes or victims that are being oppressed. And it is at this stage I'd like to compare Westworld to another show currently airing about artificial intelligence, a show called Humans. Now, whenever I see these two shows compared so far, it's to state that Humans doesn't hold a candle to Westworld. And in terms of production value, acting, cinematography, and general hype, I'd agree. But in terms of storytelling and presenting dynamic, well-rounded characters, I'd have to disagree. In fact, I would personally say that Humans is a better show. And without getting into spoilers for that show, here's why. There are no clear heroes or villains in that show. The overall picture in both shows are similar, where a world is created where humans see the AIs as nothing more than products or merchandise to do with as they please, and the AIs start to feel oppressed. The difference is, in the show Humans, no character was presented as two-dimensional, and overall situation was presented as far more complex. For example, there are AIs and humans who are openly hostile and antagonistic. However, you understand why they are that way and can sympathize with them. Likewise, there are human characters who can be seen as antagonistic and cruel towards the AIs, but agree that they are so well-rounded and complex that you can see where they're coming from as well. Whereas in Westworld, the only humans who are presented as well-rounded and complex were the ones that kind of sympathized with the AIs, thus presenting an entire cast of characters as one-sided, flat bad guys. Now, I know this could change in Season 2, but as I said, at the moment I only have Season 1 to go by, and so far I'd say this presents a story that lacks overall dynamic or sense of complexity, at least as far as its characters are concerned. Also, I do have to say I feel the ending was a bit overhyped for me as well, as I heard even from the detractors that the ending in the final episode in particular was amazing. And although I did enjoy it and did think it was a powerful episode, it wasn't nearly as inspiring as all the hype led me to believe. I was expecting more out of it than I got, and perhaps my expectations were unrealistic, but they were based directly off of what I was hearing from everyone talking about the ending. For example, I heard many say that they were amazed and surprised that the show revealed as many of the lingering mysteries as it did, and they suspected the season would end on a more ambiguous note. And others who said they felt the season finale could have ended the show and the whole season felt self-contained. First off, I gotta say, it's that last statement that led me to the most disappointment that I felt with the finale, as I totally disagree with that statement and would say that if the show ended at the end of Season 1, it would feel very incomplete to me, and I would not at all describe Season 1 as self-contained. A self-contained season seems more like something like Stranger Things, where this was not nearly as tied up and felt more open-ended. So it was these sentiments more than anything else is why I was expecting a lot more out of the finale than I got, as I personally found many of the lingering stories felt highly unresolved to me, much more so than I was expecting based off of all these statements I was hearing. And as for the many mysteries being resolved much more so than others expected, I disagree with this as well. In fact, I would argue, had they not revealed the answers to these mysteries in Season 1, I would have considered the entire season a failure and declared that the show sucked. But I believe that the show presented these mysteries in such a way and gave them such importance that in order for the season not to totally suck, they needed to be resolved in the season itself. Therefore, I feel less inclined to heap praise on the show as being outstanding for doing what it needed to do in order for it to not suck. So I will say this about the ending: it did not suck. But, I mean, that's not entirely fair because I actually did really enjoy the finale, and I think I would have enjoyed it even more had it not been for these unrealistic expectations. So one pet peeve I have against films and shows is that some of them tend to be too convoluted, and I have no issue with films with surprise endings, but sometimes when a film has too many surprise endings, it feels really fake and contrived. I mentioned this in my review for Captain America Civil War, but there are some worse examples out there, like that horrible John Travolta movie, Basic. Now, I am not saying that Westworld falls into this category, but it teeters on the edge of it. It came dangerously close to having too many twists, but it didn't quite get there, and I'll talk more about this in the spoiler section, but suffice to say, none of these twists felt convoluted or fake to me. They all worked, but it was close, and I thought they were pushing their luck slightly, but thankfully they didn't actually go over the edge. So enough about what held this show back from being considered one of the best shows of all time for me. Let me now get into what I really liked about the show and why I would say that I overall enjoyed the show and think of it as a top-notch quality show. And the main thing overall in this regard is its many complexities. As much as I complained about the lack in dynamic characters and bad pacing, the structure of the plot overall is beautiful and a complex thing. As Westworld is one of those shows that you can watch it for a second time and see things in a totally different way and have a totally different experience upon a second viewing, and those are always my favorite shows and movies, the ones that actually improve upon multiple viewings and where one can watch it multiple times and pick up on something new every time. This is a much harder thing to accomplish in storytelling, so I love whenever a show or film can accomplish this, and it was certainly the case here, as the revelations that came later in the season really do make you look differently on how the earlier episodes in the seasons play out. And along the same lines, this is a very thinky show. It's not the kind of show you want to just lay back and have some beer and popcorn and turn your brain off. You constantly have to be thinking and analyzing what you're seeing and how it connects to what came before. And I absolutely loved that. In fact, I'd expect nothing less from a show where Jonathan Nolan is one of the showrunners. Jonathan Nolan, of course, is the brother of famous director Christopher Nolan and is credited as co-writing many of his films like Memento, The Prestige, and Interstellar, some of my favorite thinky films that make you want to watch it more than once. And you can tell Westworld has that Nolan-esque feel to it, even if Christopher isn't involved. And of course, this show has one of the best quality of production value of any other show currently airing. I mean, HBO very clearly spared no expense for this show. The level of production value is through the roof, not just with things like cinematography, editing, special effects, and luscious landscapes, but also acting. I mean, obviously, when you get actors like Anthony Hopkins and Ed Harris, you're going to expect a top-notch level of acting, and it absolutely delivers in spades. As every scene Hopkins is in, he absolutely steals the scene with top-notch, very nuanced performances. In fact, I was watching a video earlier that analyzed one of his performances in Westworld and pointed out just how nuanced and well thought out it was. But I would argue it wasn't just Anthony Hopkins. There are some amazing performances by other actors such as Jeffrey Wright, who many may recognize from the Hunger Games movies, who played Bernard, or Thandie Newton, who's been in films like Crash, who played the character of Maeve, or Evan Rachel Wood, who played the character of Dolores. Many of these actors gave highly nuanced performances, bringing another level of complexity to the show. Although there are a few supporting actors whose performances are kind of flat, but that's because the characters weren't written very well. But I'm not getting into that. Now I'm talking about the positives. And when talking about production value, have to talk about the music, as the music in this show was absolutely amazing. The original score is great and only enhances the quality of the show, but in addition to that, there are a lot of uses of pop culture rock songs that blend in seamlessly into the show. A common occurrence in the show is whenever a song is playing on the piano in the tavern in the Old West style, it is often a modern rock song. For example, in the premiere episode, it featured the Rolling Stones' Painted Black and Soundgarden's Black Hole Sun. In fact, I didn't always recognize the song playing on the piano, but I always knew it was a modern song. In fact, the show would often use a barrage of Radiohead songs, not just the popular ones, so this leads me to believe they had some sort of deal to use bulk Radiohead songs, or maybe someone involved in the show is a huge Radiohead fan. But I've always been a huge Radiohead fan myself, so I really appreciated this. In fact, one scene in particular uses a Radiohead song so well it brought me to tears. So overall, the music in this show is so well used, it definitely enhances the overall experience. So my rating for Westworld Season 1 out of 10 is an 8, extremely good. I love shows that make you think and those that you can watch multiple times and pick up something new every time. This show also had amazing production value with outstanding performances by great actors and some outstanding music and other high production values like cinematography and editing. The story of the season was a complicated puzzle with all the pieces being slowly revealed at the right stage in order to keep the show engaging and give the viewers something to ponder over. But the pacing of the season wasn't the best, as it began moving too slowly, focusing too much on underdeveloped side characters who came off as flat caricatures in contrast to the rich dynamic characters who were all either AIs or sympathized with the AIs, thus presenting a lopsided narrative that skewers the viewers towards sympathizing with the AIs. And I must admit, the ridiculous amount of hype that the show got did hold it back a little bit for me, as it set too high of a standard for most shows to live up to. That being said, this is definitely a top-notch quality show I can't wait to see more of, so I do want to emphasize to anyone planning on making comments asking me why I hate Westworld so much, that an 8 is actually a really high rating, and I firmly stand behind this 8. In fact, I was close to giving this show a 9, however the hype and some of the flaws I mentioned kind of held it back to me a little bit. And yes, an 8 is not a 10, but just to put it into context for you, another show that I love and review regularly is Vikings, which I gave seasons 1 through 3 a 7. And another show I was reviewing earlier this year that I thought was really great and high quality was Mr. Robot, but I gave season 2 a 7. So an 8 is a high review, and for those who say it seems higher than what my review seems to indicate, I will re-emphasize that many of the complaints I have about this show aren't that huge and mostly just hold it back for me a little bit from being great. And if there is one thing I want to emphasize the most, is that I thought this show was really complex, highly intellectual, and those are qualities I absolutely love in shows and films. So yes, I would call Westworld a top-notch quality show. So now let me get into the spoiler section of this video, where I'll get a bit more into detail on some of the things I talked about in my spoiler-free section. So if you haven't seen all of Season 1 of Westworld, you'll want to turn the video off now, and thanks a lot for watching. But those of you who have can continue onwards. And since I like to end the video on a positive note, let me start the spoiler section by expanding on the issues I had with the show that bothered me, so I can end the spoiler section with what I liked about it. In particular, I'd like to explain more my statements about how flat and two-dimensional the human characters were and how it led to a one-sided view that leads viewers to sympathize with the host, because I'm sure as I was saying this, many of you were screaming at me, what about the man in black who we learn is William? And what about Robert Ford, who at first appears to be a villain but is later revealed to be working for the benefits of the host? Well, if you recall, I did say there were two exceptions to this, and I was thinking specifically about Ford and William, and that's what I meant by the human characters who were dynamic were sympathetic to the host, as William was portrayed the whole time as someone who relates to Dolores and recognizes the values in her, and Ford, we learned, was working the whole time to allow the host to take over. Now, you may say, but what about the Man in Black, who is a villain, and he was going around torturing and killing hosts, and we learned that he was William the whole time. So he was at one point sympathetic to the host, but was soured over the years through the fact of them being mindless automatons. And I would argue all the suffering he inflicts was to try to break them out of this monotony, and he explained in the story when he killed Maeve and her daughter, he was struck by how alive she became in that moment. So arguably, all of the suffering he was inflicting on the host were trying to wake them up. And his quest to find the maze wasn't simply a selfish desire for a funner game, but was in fact tied into the flashbacks we saw with him as William and his affections for Dolores. But I digress. Point is, William and Ford are the only two dynamic human characters, and they are both, in one way or another, sympathetic to the AIs, whereas characters like Teresa, Charlotte, Stubbs, Elsie, Logan, Sylvester, and Sizemore were all flat, two-dimensional, cliched characters. So characters like Elsie and Stubbs arguably didn't appear enough to be developed, but to me still came off as one-beat, one-note characters, ironically just like they tend to try to want to portray some of the hosts in the story as being. Teresa was mainly just the stuck-up boss getting in the way. Well, it's true they did try to humanize her a bit by showing her position as being, manipulated and strong-armed by her superiors and thus didn't have a choice in the matter. She still came off as a rather flat and uninteresting character. In particular, when her romance with Bernard was revealed, I literally rolled my eyes and scoffed, as it seemed exactly like the sort of typical TV cliche, and the two of them didn't seem to have any chemistry together whatsoever. Of course, later on we learned it was also to service the plot, but that doesn't actually make it any more believable. And then there's Charlotte, who I'm sure had she been a male character, they would have given her a mustache so she could twirl it, which would have been very appropriate. But But they did the very next best thing by having her have meaningless sex with hosts for no good reason. I mean, talk about a two-dimensional corporate villain. Honestly, this is the type of character I expect to see in an Adam Sandler movie, not in what is supposed to be one of the best TV shows of all time. And that brings up Sizemore, another walking, talking, egotistical, artistic cliche put into motion, who's annoying and not at all believable as a real human being. And to top that off, we get this scene where Sizemore meets Charlotte, where he hits on her at the bar, not knowing who she was, not knowing that she was this top executive, and then later, hardy har har, he finds out that she's this big executive while his dick is hanging out. Okay, so when I saw these scenes, I had to wonder to myself, did I accidentally change the show and was now watching Three's Company? Was I actually watching an episode of Friends the whole time when I thought I was watching Westworld? I mean, seriously, was there a laugh track in this? Because this is exactly the type of scene where a laugh track should have been playing. I mean, seriously, what in the fuck is this cliched sitcom bullshit doing in what is supposedly one of the best shows of all time? Personally, I feel this scene alone disqualifies this show for being even mentioned in the same breath as Game of Thrones or Breaking Bad, but that's just me. And then there's Logan, who is just every asshole stereotype rolled into one character, who does not at all feel like a real person in the slightest. And also Sylvester, who is similarly the stereotypical asshole, and he only exists as a plot point and not a dynamic character in his own right. But you may have noticed one human character I have yet to mention is Felix, and that's because although I wouldn't call this character dynamic, I don't really think we saw enough of him to be considered dynamic, but I do believe his character and the role he played fit, and he did come off to me as a real-life person rather than a walking, talking cliche. But then again, this was another character that sympathized with the hosts. So another thing that kind of bothered me is the way all the guests were portrayed as exactly the same. They're all rich assholes that just like to kill and fuck everything in sight with no variety, no dynamic to them whatsoever. So I wish that they would have explored the guests more in the show. In fact, I would have liked to see more guest interactions, as I kept wondering what would happen to a guest if they ran into another guest. Do they have some way of telling them apart from the host? What would happen if a guest tried to kill another guest? Would there be safeguards in place to stop this? And yes, I would have really liked to have seen a guest whose sole purpose wasn't just to kill and fuck everything in sight, as judging by the way Westworld was advertised with the promotional material featuring Maeve and her daughter. You think it would be meant to appeal to many different sensibilities, not just the primal ones. I know there's William. So what about William? Yeah, he was the one exception, and he was with Logan, an asshole who wanted to kill, so that doesn't count. And I suppose the story, the in-story excuse is that there aren't that many guests in the park, which is another thing I find hard to believe. If their sole purpose is to make money and to be a business, you'd think they'd have more accessible parts of the park where you wouldn't need to be a billionaire to have access to. At the very least, there'd be a lot more guests in the park than there was, but whatever. I mean, it seems like it would cost a lot to operate and keep it going, and if there's no people around paying for it, then it seems like a waste of money. I mean, from a corporate perspective, and that, guess what? It's owned by a corporation. But anyway, so let's talk about these revelations. In episode 7, we got a big one where we found out Bernard was really a host. And in episode 9, we found out that Bernard was actually modeled after Arnold, the man who helped create the park with Ford. Now, I found the first of these revelations really shocking, as I was not at all expecting it. I would say I was particularly blown away by it, but I definitely didn't see it coming, and would say it was very effective storytelling. However, as I mentioned in the spoiler-free section of my video, I felt that they became in danger of having too many plot twists and becoming a bit convoluted, and I didn't think they got there, but they were dangerously close to it, and I was specifically referring to the twist that Bernard was modeled after Arnold. Don't get me wrong, I didn't hate this twist, and I do think it made the finale really interesting when we learned that the scenes we saw earlier this season with Dolores talking to Bernard was actually her talking to Arnold. But it did seem like it was dangerously close to becoming a bit too much, as ultimately it wasn't really necessary, and I just wasn't as impressed with this revelation as I was with some of the others. Because here's one major nitpick I have with this revelation. How could Ford make a host and pass him off as a human being if that host looked exactly like the dead partner that he had to help to create the park with, without anyone noticing? Now, I know they tried to make excuses in the show that no one was really around when the park was first created and no one really knew who Arnold was, but come on. When you think about it, when the corporate board bought this park, they would have done a lot of research on its creators, and maybe even a little bit of research on its creators, and there must have been pictures of Arnold floating around. I mean, we're talking about the future here, and even with modern technology, pretty much anyone would be able to figure out that this man working as the lead scientist in the park looks exactly like the man who helped create that park. I mean, the other day I saw this meme that was joking around about Lois Lane looking at a picture of herself with Superman on Facebook, and where this Facebook thing says "want to tag Clark Kent" over the picture of Superman's face. You think that likewise there'd be other automatic systems in the bloody future that would be able to recognize that Bernard looks just like Arnold. But anyway, as I say, that's a nitpick. So now, let me get into the spoilery reasons on why I love the show. And first of all, the way they played with linear time, as I absolutely love films that are able to play with linear time and do it in a way that makes sense and fits. This is not at all an easy task to accomplish, and of course the fact that the show was playing with linear time wasn't revealed until the finale, so it's one of those things you can go back and watch the show again and pick up on, is all the different time periods. And the way this was explained in the show was perfect, as well as they explain the hosts don't remember things the way that people do, that they experience it as if they're experiencing it for the first first time, and this was played with beautifully to mix up the time frames, as it had an understandably confusing effect on the hosts themselves, and it was a way to have different time periods going on at the same time. And of course, the biggest example of this was the revelation that William and Logan's storyline was taking place in the past, as the show did a careful job of making it seem like it was the present, and I think that the way they did it worked very well. This was the revelation I was referring to that was ruined for me when I heard about fan theories, because as soon as I heard it, I knew it was true, although the theory I heard was that Logan was the Man in Black, and indeed it did seem like the finale, they were at first trying to trick you into thinking that was the case, but it was so much more powerful revelation that it was William that was the Man in Black. It showed how effectively changed that he had been throughout the years, and how Westworld had changed him, and it made him a much more interesting and dynamic character. However, I should have suspected that Jonathan Nolan, a man who helped write Memento, would be good at playing with linear time. Now, my favorite storyline of the season had to be Maeve's storyline, as it was the one aspect of the show I absolutely had no problem with and thought her storyline played out beautifully. My favorite scene of the whole season had to be the scene where Felix first brought Maeve to the upper levels, where she for the first time was saying the whole world was fake and created. And this was the scene I was referring to that played a version of a Radiohead song that made me cry, as it had a violin version of the song Motion Picture soundtrack. And I mean, there have been so many movies or shows that, you know, tries to create a world. They find out the world that they were living in is fake, like The Matrix or whatever. But I've never seen it pulled off as powerfully and heartbreaking as it was in this scene. It was played out so well. In fact, Maeve's whole storyline had a real Truman Show feel to it, as she found out her whole world was staged for someone else's entertainment, and then her main goal became to escape. Side note, Ed Harris was also in the Truman Show, but yeah, I couldn't help but see the parallels to that movie. Also, in the scene where Dolores is dying in Teddy's arm, and it's a real touching scene, and then they pull back and reveal it's all just the show that all the guests are watching as Ford gives a speech. That was felt very much like the Truman Show as well. But getting back to Maeve, the only small issue I had was because of the false expectations I had that the season 1 was self-contained, because I was thinking that I was expecting a bit more out of her in the finale. However, once I realized that those expectations were false, I do see how the whole thing was brilliant, and its ending does work very well as the ending of a first chapter, and it will be interesting to see where they take her from there. And it was interesting when we discovered that her whole need to escape was a narrative programmed into her, and I have no doubt that it was done by Ford, as her little escape served as a distraction for the security teams as Ford planned his huge takeover of the park. And I do believe that her decision to not leave the park and instead go after her daughter was the first decision she actually made on her own, that she wasn't programmed to. That being said, her not escaping might mess up Ford's ultimate plan, which was for the mainland infiltration, so this may have some implications down the line. It was also interesting learning her backstory, and that she seemed to be more conscious because of her suffering. So it kind of makes sense that she had a connection with her daughter, even if she realizes that it's not really her daughter. She has this connection that transcends her programming. So yes, I absolutely love the way this played out, and I thought her storyline was perfect. So yes, despite any complaints or nitpicks I have about the show, I must admit there is a lot about it to admire. As I said, the more I think about the show, the more I like it, and that is a sign of a great show. So I'm sure if they shore up the pacing and start to add some dynamic human characters, this show does have the potential to be a truly great show, and who knows, maybe after season 2 I will be saying Westworld is one of the best shows on television. It certainly has that potential, but we'll see. So that's it for my review of Westworld. Please be sure to check out my channel as I continue reviewing newer shows currently airing. Also be sure to check out my channel for many more videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Humans, Vikings, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.